The fire had burned low in the east drawing room of Ashworth Hall by the time anyone thought to speak of him again. It was Lady Meredith Fontaine who said it first. She always said everything first, which was both her gift and the reason no one in London truly trusted her. She set down her teacup with the particular delicacy of a woman who wanted you to notice how delicately she was setting it down. And she said, in the tone of someone sharing a secret they had already told 17 people, "He is coming back." The room shifted. Not dramatically. These were women trained from infancy to suppress the dramatic impulse, to transform it into something more socially acceptable, like an arched brow or a slight rearrangement of skirts. But the shift was there. It moved through the assembled ladies like a cold draught, finding the gaps in old stonework. "The Duke," said someone near the window. The question was unnecessary. There was only one he in London whose return required that tone of voice, that specific quality of suspended breath, that careful arrangement of the face into something resembling neutrality. "The Duke," Lady Meredith confirmed, and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Across the room, seated slightly apart from the others in the way she had learned to occupy space, present but not crowding, visible but not performing, Ilara Voss set down her embroidery and said nothing. She had become rather accomplished at saying nothing. It was a skill she had developed with considerable urgency over the past 6 months, ever since the evening at the Hargreave Ball when she had done the opposite of nothing, when she had done the one thing that London society had not forgiven and would not forget. She had laughed. Not a small laugh, not the kind of restrained, socially permissible laugh that served as a social lubricant in polite company. The kind that acknowledged wit without committing to genuine amusement. She had laughed the way she laughed when she was alone, when something struck her as genuinely, helplessly absurd. A real laugh, full-throated and unguarded, rising out of her chest like a bird startled from cover. It had lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It had felt, in retrospect, like the 4 most consequential seconds of her life, because the thing that had struck her as genuinely, helplessly absurd was the Duke of Ravenswood's proposal of marriage. She could not, even now, entirely blame herself for the laugh. She could trace its origins with clinical precision. The setting, the timing, the catalogue of available evidence that had pointed, overwhelmingly, toward a cruel joke. The Hargreave Ball had been precisely the kind of gathering where such jokes were orchestrated, carefully, maliciously, by the kind of women who understood that humiliation was a social currency and spent it without remorse. Ilara had enemies. She had always had enemies, had collected them the way other women collected admirers, not by seeking them out, but by the simple fact of being herself in rooms that preferred her to be someone else. She was the daughter of a German merchant of modest fortune and considerable reputation, which was to say, she had the kind of background that made her interesting at first and unacceptable on reflection. She had opinions, and the unfortunate habit of voicing them. She had refused 2 previous marriage proposals from men who were well-connected and dull, and she had not been entirely tactful about the refusals. So, when the Duke of Ravenswood, the Duke, cold and impenetrable, and so far above her in the social architecture of England that the distance approached the cosmological, when he appeared beside her on the terrace at the Hargreave Ball and said, with his characteristic economy of expression, "Miss Voss, I would like to ask you to become my wife," she had not believed him. She had, in fact, been so entirely certain that this was the most elaborately staged piece of mockery she had ever been subjected to, had been so keenly aware of the ring of watching faces beyond the terrace doors, the suppressed anticipation of it, the setup that her enemies had constructed with such obvious enjoyment, that she had laughed. She had laughed because the alternative, in that moment, was to cry, and she had not cried in front of anyone since she was 9 years old, and she was not about to start. The Duke had looked at her for a moment that contained more silence than a moment should reasonably hold. He had said nothing. He had made a small, precise bow. He had walked back through the terrace doors, through the assembled, stunned company of the Hargreave Ballroom, and out of London altogether, and no one had seen him for 6 months. And now, according to Lady Meredith Fontaine, He was coming back. Ilara picked up her embroidery again. The needle found its way through the linen by memory rather than attention, because her attention was occupied elsewhere, in the particular interior landscape she had spent 6 months cultivating, the one in which she had done nothing wrong, had reacted precisely as any reasonable person would have reacted, given the available evidence, and in which the cold weight she carried in her chest, whenever she thought of his face in that moment, was simply the natural consequence of having been placed unjustly in an impossible situation. She was, she had decided long ago, very good at telling herself necessary stories. "I wonder what he will do," said the woman near the window, whose name was something like Hartley or Hartwell, and who appeared to exist primarily to voice the things other people were thinking. "I imagine," said Lady Meredith, still smiling, "that will depend very much on Miss Voss." Every face in the room turned toward her. Ilara set the needle through the linen with perfect steadiness. "I imagine," she said, without looking up, "that it will depend very much on the Duke." The silence that followed was the kind that had its own texture, its own weight. Ilara had learned to be comfortable in silences like this one. She had not always been comfortable in them. That was another thing the last 6 months had taught her. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare chestnut trees lining the avenue, and the sound it made was something between a whisper and a warning. And the fire had burned so low now that the shadows in the east drawing room of Ashworth Hall were long and cold. And somewhere in the distance, on the road that ran south through the frost-hardened fields toward London, a coach was moving. She did not know this yet, but she would know it soon. His name was Julian Ashworth Cavendish, 5th Duke of Ravenswood, and he had spent the last 6 months doing something that no one in his family had done in 4 generations. He had been honest with himself. It had not, on the whole, been a comfortable experience. He was 41 miles south of London when the process had truly begun, sitting in the corner of a post house with a glass of brandy he wasn't drinking and a letter he had written and torn up 3 times, staring at the fireplace with the fixed attention of a man attempting to set his own thoughts on fire. He had been told all his life, by his father, by his tutors, by the general consensus of a society that mistook emotional suppression for strength, that feeling too much was a kind of weakness. He had believed this, had organized his entire interior architecture around this belief, had built the reputation for coldness and impenetrability that London found simultaneously intimidating and fascinating. He was the Duke of Ravenswood. He did not feel too much. Except that a woman he had known for 7 months had laughed at his marriage proposal, and he had left London like a man fleeing a battlefield, and he had spent the last 6 months not sleeping particularly well, which suggested that perhaps the architecture required examination. The thing he had known, sitting in that post house with the untouched brandy and the accumulating pile of torn letter fragments, was this. She had thought he was mocking her. He understood this now, had not understood it in the first stunned seconds on the terrace, when the laugh hit him like cold water, had spent weeks rotating the memory and discovering new angles. She had been surrounded by enemies that evening. He knew this because he had been paying attention to her for 7 months, which was something he had not admitted to himself until the 31st of those 6 months, when the accumulated evidence of his own behavior became too dense to interpret any other way. He had been watching her. He had been listening to her speak at dinner parties with the specific, fascinated attention of a man who has not heard anything genuinely interesting in several years. He had read 3 of the books she mentioned in passing and had opinions about all of them that he wanted urgently to share with her. He had arranged, with more subtlety than he was perhaps proud of, to be present at several of the same events she attended. He had, in short, fallen in love with her approximately 5 months before he proposed, had spent the 6th month determining whether this was a temporary aberration or something he intended to act on, and had chosen the Hargreave ball because the terrace offered privacy, and because he had, in a rare moment of miscalculation, entirely failed to account for how the evening appeared from her perspective. He had not thought about how she saw it. He had been too occupied with his own fear, which was a significant fear, larger than he had expected it to be when he walked out onto that terrace. Because Julian Ashworth Cavendish had loved precisely one person before in his life, and that person had died, and the year that followed had taught him things about grief that he could not unlearn. And he had looked at Alara Voss laughing at his proposal and understood, in the first breathless second, that the risk he was taking was real. He had not understood, in that second, that she was not laughing at him. That came later, slowly, in the patient self-examination of 6 months of solitude and honesty, along with the understanding that if he had given her any indication, any at all, any of the 7 months of careful, burning, entirely unexpressed attention, she would not have laughed. She would have known he meant it. She would have had the evidence that made the proposal credible. The failure was his. He had been so practiced at concealment that he had concealed himself even from the one person from whom he did not want to be concealed. He was going back to London. He was going to see her. He had not decided yet what he would say. He knew only that the story was not finished, that the laugh was not the end of it, that he had walked away once out of wounded pride that he was not willing to call wounded pride, and that he was done walking away. The coach moved through the November dark, the horse's breath fogged in the cold air. Julian Cavendish looked out at the passing fields and felt, for the first time in 6 months, something that was not quite the cold weight of self-examination, but something lighter, more dangerous, more entirely unwelcome in its complexity. He felt, if he was being honest with himself, which he had apparently decided to be, hopeful. He found this alarming. He held on to it anyway. London received him the way it received everything it was uncertain about, with the performance of indifference. His townhouse on Grosvenor Square had been maintained in his absence with the mechanical efficiency of a staff accustomed to the unpredictable schedules of aristocratic employers. And when his coach drew up to the door on a Tuesday evening in November, his butler Graves opened it with the measured solemnity that suggested the Duke had been gone 40 minutes rather than 6 months. "Your Grace," said Graves, in a tone of immaculate neutrality. "Graves," said Julian, stepping down from the coach and standing for a moment in the cold air, looking up at the face of the house. It looked exactly as it had looked when he left it. He did not know what he had expected. "Is everything in order?" "Everything is precisely as you left it, Your Grace." "Of course it is," Julian said, and went inside. The house was cold in the particular way of houses that have been kept technically warm but not inhabited. The fires burning, but the rooms empty, the heat mechanical rather than lived in. He moved through the ground floor with the brisk, purposeful stride of a man who had spent 6 months in smaller spaces and found the proportions of his own life suddenly slightly absurd. The ceilings in Ravenswood House were 17 feet high. The drawing room could comfortably hold 60 people. The dining room held a table that seated 40 and was, in his absence, the territory of no one. He had spent his childhood being told this house was evidence of his family's greatness. He stood in the center of the drawing room now and found it cold and overlarge and embarrassingly empty, and thought that this was, perhaps, the more honest verdict. His brother found him there an hour later, standing at the window with a glass of whiskey. He was actually drinking this time, watching the street. Edmund Cavendish was 7 years younger than Julian, lighter in every sense, lighter in colouring, lighter in manner, more inclined toward warmth and laughter, constitutionally unable to maintain a silence that needed filling. He was also, Julian had long ago acknowledged, the only person in England who said true things to him without first wrapping them in sufficient social padding to guarantee safety. It was a quality Julian found both essential and occasionally exhausting. "You look," Edmund said, dropping into a chair with the comfortable familiarity of a man in his own home, which Ravenswood House largely was in Julian's absence. "Like a man who has reached a conclusion." "I am a man who has reached a conclusion," Julian said, without turning from the window. "Does the conclusion involve a certain Miss Voss?" Julian turned from the window then. Edmund was watching him with the careful attention of a person who was genuinely interested and genuinely concerned, and was managing both simultaneously. He was 34 years old and still managed to look younger than he was, which Julian had always found slightly unfair. "It involves a significant number of things," Julian said. "Miss Voss is among them." "She's in London," Edmund said. "In case you were wondering. She stayed. Everyone expected her to leave after. Everyone expected her to go back to Bath, or to the continent, or to simply dissolve from embarrassment. She didn't. She's been at Lady Ashworth's house for 3 months, and before that, she was at the Cartwright estate in Surrey, and she has attended every significant social event of the autumn season with the bearing of a woman who is absolutely prepared to be stared at, and has decided to find it slightly boring." Julian looked at him for a moment. "You'd been keeping track of her?" "I've been keeping track of the situation," Edmund said, with the precision of a man making a distinction that mattered to him. "Because you are my brother, and you left London looking as though someone had removed something essential from your internal workings, and I was concerned. And I watched the situation accordingly. She is not," he added, more quietly, "what London says she is." "I know what she is," Julian said. Edmund studied him. Then he nodded, once, the way he did when he believed something entirely and didn't need to say more. "What are you going to do?" Julian looked back out the window at the lamplit street, at the figures moving through the November cold, at the distance between here and the east side of the city where he knew, now, she was sleeping, or reading, or sitting awake with her own particular brand of contained and private determination. "I'm going to find an opportunity," he said, "to speak with her." That is a very controlled way of describing what is, if I understand correctly, a significant emotional undertaking. "Yes," Julian said. "Well," he drank the whiskey, "I'm working on it." Edmund laughed, soft and brief, and for a moment the drawing room, with its 17-foot ceilings and its 40-seat dining table and its 7 years of accumulated cold, was a degree or two warmer. The opportunity arrived, as opportunities in London tended to arrive, wrapped in an invitation. The Pemberton Winter Gathering, a dinner of 40 guests at the Pemberton House on Park Lane, structured around the twins' social obligations of being seen and tolerating the company of people one would not voluntarily choose, was the first significant event of his return. He had received the invitation the morning after his arrival, in the particular way that indicated Lady Pemberton's information network was functioning with its customary speed. He accepted it. He was aware, from Edmund's accounting, that Elara Voss was also likely to attend. He was aware that their simultaneous presence would be the primary subject of discussion among the assembled 40 before the first course arrived. He dressed for the Pemberton dinner with his customary precision and without his customary detachment. He noted this without surprise. He had resolved, in those 41 miles of honest self-examination, that the detachment was not serving him. He would continue to be precise. Precision was a genuine quality, not a performance. But the detachment was over. He was not entirely sure what replaced it. He supposed he would find out. The Pemberton house was warmly lit against the November dark, its windows glowing amber, the sound of conversation and music pressing faintly against the glass as his coach drew up. He descended to the street, adjusted his coat, and went in. The room had the particular quality of rooms that are simultaneously aware of themselves and pretending not to be. Faces turned, subtly, with the practiced subtlety of people who had trained themselves to observe without appearing to observe. He moved through the greetings with the measured ease of long practice, said the appropriate things, accepted a glass, and did not, in the first 3 minutes, look for her. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice. She was not speaking. It was the particular shift in the room's conversational energy that he had learned, in 7 months of paying attention, to associate with her presence. A slight uptick in alertness near the northeast end of the room, the way a candle flame lifts when a door opens somewhere. He turned. She was standing near the window with Lady Ashworth, and a man he recognized as Charles Fontaine, Lady Meredith's cousin, and she was wearing dark blue, which was not a colour she had worn before in his memory, and her hair was arranged more simply than usual, and she was listening to something Fontaine was saying with the expression she wore when she was being politely interested in something that did not particularly interest her. A very slight elevation of the brows, a stillness of the eyes that looked like engagement and was actually patience. Then she saw him. The patience disappeared. It was replaced, for precisely 2 seconds, with something undefended and honest that she collected immediately and locked away, rearranging her expression with a speed that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 7 months memorizing her face. She looked at him directly for 1 additional second, and then she looked at Fontaine, and she said something that made Fontaine laugh, and she did not look at Julian again. He had seen it, though. 2 seconds of undefended truth, and what had been in it was not cold, and it was not indifferent, and it was not over. He stood with his glass, and the feeling in his chest that was the opposite of emptiness, and he allowed himself, for the first time in 6 months, to think the word clearly, without qualification. Good. They were not seated near each other at dinner, which he suspected was either Lady Pemberton's idea of diplomacy or her idea of theatre, and which resulted in 40 people spending 2 hours eating very good food while distributing their attention between their own conversations and the northeast and southwest ends of the table, where Alara and Julian sat at a distance of approximately 23 feet and conducted the loudest silence either of them had ever been part of. He spoke, when called upon, with his customary ease. She spoke, when called upon, with her customary intelligence, and he listened to every word she said at his end of the table, while appearing to attend to his neighbours, and he was aware, in the precise and attentive way that 6 months of honest self-examination had sharpened, that she was doing the same. Dinner ended. The company moved to the drawing rooms. The natural currents of a gathering of 40 people in 3 interconnected rooms created, eventually, the moment he had been waiting for. The 2 of them within speaking distance, with a gap of approximately 4 feet between them and the nearest other guests, and no immediate social obligation requiring either of them to address anyone else. He moved to stand beside her. She did not move away. This was, he thought, the bravest small gesture he had witnessed in 6 months, given everything, and it landed somewhere below his sternum, with the soft, precise weight of something he intended to carry carefully. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. They stood for a moment, looking at the room rather than each other, in the way that people stand at the edge of things when they are not yet ready to step in. The fire at the far end of the drawing room was high and warm, and the lighted cast was gold against the ivory and pale blue of the assembled company. And the sound of the room, conversation and laughter, and the soft percussion of glass against glass, continued around them like something indifferent to the specific gravity of where they were standing. "I understand you remained in London," he said. "I did," she said. "I did not." A pause. "I imagine that was observed." "Everything is observed," she said. And then, after a beat, in a lower register, "I was not certain you would return." He turned to look at her then, because the tone of the last sentence required it. That particular shift between the sociable surface and the thing underneath. She was still looking at the room, her chin lifted in the way she held it when she was marshalling something, and her hands were still at her sides. And she looked, he thought, exactly like a woman who was carrying 6 months of something, and had become very practiced at carrying it lightly. "I was not certain I would either," he said. "And then I was." She looked at him. The look lasted longer than 2 seconds this time, long enough that he could see the question in it, layered and specific. Not the general why, but the particular what changed. And beneath that, even more specifically, the question she was not yet ready to ask with words, which was, what does this mean? He did not answer the question she wasn't asking. Not yet. He had not earned that answer yet, and he knew it. And the knowing of it was part of what 6 months of honesty had built in him. A clearer sense of what was his to give, and when. "I hope," he said, returning his gaze to the room, "that the season has been acceptable." The word was so inadequate to everything it was describing that it crossed into the territory of the dry and the almost absurd. And he felt, rather than saw, the shift in her. the very small relaxation, the breath that was marginally longer than the previous one. "Acceptable," she repeated, with a quality in her voice that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. That was the particular sound she made when something struck her as precisely the right wrong word. "Yes, it has been acceptable." "Good," he said. Another pause. Around them the room moved and talked and performed its social obligations with cheerful indifference. "Your Grace," she said, and stopped. "Yes," he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only—" She stopped again. Her hands, he noticed, were not entirely still now. The fingers of her right hand had made a small, almost invisible movement, a half curl and release. "I am glad you came back." The simplicity of it, the cost of it. He could see both, and he stood with them for a moment before he answered, because the moment deserved the space. "So am I," he said. They did not speak again that evening. The room's currents eventually separated them, carried them into the orbits of other conversations, other obligations, the long, mechanical social ritual of departure and good nights, and the cold November street. But something had shifted, as definitively as weather, as quietly as a key turning in a lock, and both of them felt it, and neither of them performed not feeling it. In the coach home, Elara sat in the dark and looked at her hands in her lap and thought, he meant it. 6 months ago on the terrace at the Hargreave ball, in the middle of all that staged malice, surrounded by people who wanted her to fail, he meant it. She had laughed, and he had meant it. And she had spent 6 months carrying the weight of not knowing whether she had destroyed something real, or merely embarrassed herself in the destruction of something false. And now she knew, and the knowing was not the relief she had expected. It was something more complicated, more tender and more frightening, less comfortable and more alive. She pressed her hands together in her lap, not for warmth, and looked out the window at the passing lamps of London, and thought, what happens now? In his own coach, moving in the opposite direction through the same November streets, Julian Cavendish sat with his hands on his knees and felt, with greater clarity than he had felt anything in a long time, the specific, inconvenient, entirely real nature of what he was dealing with. He had come back to London for a reason. He had spoken to her for 3 minutes at a Pemberton dinner, and what he felt was not resolved. It was the opposite of resolved. It was opened, like a room that has been closed for years and now has a window in it and the cold air moving through. He had a great deal more to say. He needed to say it in a context that was not 40 people and 6 months of suspended social judgment and the particular theatre of a first, post-absence encounter. He needed, specifically, to find a way to speak to her alone, which was not, in London, a simple logistical problem. It was a social negotiation of considerable delicacy, particularly given the specific nature of their history. One did not simply arrange a private meeting with a woman one had proposed to and been laughed at by, particularly when that proposal had been the primary subject of London gossip for half a year. One navigated. One found the legitimate channels. One used, if one was Edmund, the considerable social lubrication of being charming and well-connected, and able to arrange circumstances without appearing to arrange them. Julian found Edmund in the library at midnight, reading with the comfortable absorption of a man who was genuinely happy in his own company. "I need your help," Julian said. Edmund turned the page. "I know," he said. "I've already spoken to Lady Ashworth." Julian stood in the doorway for a moment. "When?" "Before dinner. I had a feeling." Edmund looked up, and his expression was the one he wore when he was being both affectionate and gently insufferable. "She has a small musicale on Thursday, 12 guests. Miss Voss will be among them. You are now also among them. The group is intimate enough that conversation is natural and expected, and Lady Ashworth has, at my gentle suggestion, arranged the seating in the music room to allow for a degree of adjacency." Julian looked at his brother for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," said Edmund. "Now, let me read my book." Thursday's musicale was intimate in the specific way of 12 people in a well-appointed room with a good fire and a talented pianist. The kind of gathering where the social performance was minimal because the shared purpose, the music, the listening, the subsequent conversation, provided structure enough. Ilara arrived with Lady Ashworth herself, which meant she was already present when Julian came in, already seated in the inner arc of chairs that faced the pianoforte, already aware of his arrival, in the same way she had apparently become aware of him in rooms. That particular internal stillness that she had stopped trying to attribute to anything other than what it was. He sat beside her. The room arranged itself around them with the unself-conscious ease of 12 people whose attention was genuinely on the music. The pianist was young and extraordinary, and the first piece, a Schubert sonata, filled the room with something that made conversation unnecessary and silence natural. And Ilara sat in the warmth of it and listened, and beside her, very close in the way the chairs were arranged, Julian Cavendish listened too. She was aware of his stillness. It was a different quality of stillness from the kind she had observed at larger gatherings, not the controlled, watchful stillness of a public figure managing his presence, but something quieter, something that looked very much like genuine absorption. His hands rested on his knees. His face was turned toward the pianist, with an attention that was not performed. He was, she realized, actually listening. He loved music, or at least this music, and he was allowing himself to show it, and the showing of it was so entirely at odds with everything London said about him that she felt the adjustment happening in real time, the small interior recalibration of a known thing becoming more accurately known. Between the first and second pieces, in the comfortable pause while the pianist rested and conversation quietly resumed around them, he said, without turning his head, "She plays the transition in the second movement slightly faster than the score indicates." "I noticed that," Ilara said, before she had time to consider whether to say so. And then, "I wasn't certain anyone else had." He turned to look at her then, not the measured, brief look of social acknowledgement, but the direct and steady look of a person who has something to say and is deciding the speed at which to say it. "You play," he said, not a question. "My father insisted," she said. "He was a practical man. He believed music was the most efficient way to create something beautiful. It requires no particular materials, only time and attention, and the willingness to sound terrible for a significant period before sounding acceptable." A pause. "And do you sound acceptable?" "I sound," she said, "considerably better than terrible." And then, because she had apparently decided that the music and the firelight and the intimacy of 12 people in a warm room had dissolved sufficient quantities of her defenses, "I play Schubert in a way that my teacher described as technically sufficient, but emotionally excessive." He was quiet for a moment, and then, quietly, in a register she had not heard from him before, a register that was not public and not performed and not managed, he said, "That sounds exactly right." She looked at him. He was looking at the pianist again, who had returned to the keyboard, and his expression was the one she had seen only in glimpses before, in the fraction of a second before he remembered to arrange his face into something more guarded, something open, something that looked, against all the available evidence of 6 months and London's verdict and her own careful self-protective accounting, like warmth. The second piece began. She did not look away from him for a moment longer than was probably advisable. Then she looked at the pianist, and the music came back into focus, and she sat in the warmth of the room and thought, emotionally excessive. Yes, that sounded exactly right. After the musicale, in the small social period of wine and conversation that followed, they spoke for 20 minutes. Not a managed, careful 20 minutes. Not the 20 minutes of 2 people aware of being observed and performing accordingly, but a conversation that had the quality of something that had wanted to happen for a long time and was now, finally, happening. They spoke about music first, and then about the books she had mentioned 6 months ago that he had read, and he had opinions, and they disagreed on one of them, in a way that was entirely enjoyable. And she said something that made him laugh. A short, surprised sound, quickly contained but real. And the sound of it landed somewhere near her sternum and stayed there. At the end of the evening, in the hallway, in the brief overlap of coats being retrieved and carriages being called, he said, "Miss Voss." She turned. He was looking at her with the directness that was, she was beginning to understand, not coldness but its opposite. A refusal to be evasive when evasion was what he had practiced for most of his life. And so each instance of it was a small, deliberate act. "I would like," he said, "to call on you, with Lady Ashworth's permission." She looked at him. The hallway was busy with departing guests, and the candlelight was warm. And somewhere behind them, someone was saying something about the weather on Thursday, and the world was continuing in its ordinary way around this moment, which was not ordinary. "I think," she said, "that Lady Ashworth would permit it." He nodded. A small inclination of the head. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. He left. She put on her coat and stood for a moment in the cooling hallway of Lady Ashworth's townhouse, with the sound of the street coming in through the still open door and the warmth of the music room at her back, and 20 minutes of a real conversation still alive in her chest. Thursday, she thought. 3 days. She was, she discovered, going to be paying considerable attention to the time between now and Thursday. He arrived at 4 o'clock with precise punctuality and a single book under his arm, which she noticed immediately, and which Lady Ashworth, to her considerable credit, pretended not to notice at all. He was shown into the drawing room, where a fire was burning and tea had been arranged, and Lady Ashworth made a brief, gracious appearance, before finding an urgent obligation in another part of the house that would, apparently, occupy her for the better part of an hour. They sat on opposite sides of the tea table, in the comfortable, slightly formal arrangement of a proper call, and he placed the book on the table between them with the precision of someone setting down a thing they had been carrying for a while. "The third one," he said. "The one you mentioned at the Chartwell dinner in April. I found it more persuasive than the second." She looked at the book, then at him. "You kept a list," she said. "I did not keep a list," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "I have," he said after a moment, with the careful precision of a man choosing words with full awareness of their weight. "A reasonably accurate memory." "Of books mentioned at dinner parties?" A pause. "Of particular conversations." The tea was poured and sat between them, and neither of them reached for it immediately. Outside, the November afternoon light was already thinning toward grey, the short winter day giving up its last warmth against the drawing-room windows. The fire cracked once, softly. "I have a question," Alara said, "and I am going to ask it directly, because I have discovered that I am not, that the alternative is worse." He looked at her with that steady, unguarded attention that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of courage. "At the Hargreave ball," she said, "in April, on the terrace." She held his gaze. "Why then? Why?" She stopped. "Why at all?" The question held everything she had been rotating for 6 months. Not just the why of the timing, but the fundamental why. The why that preceded all the other whys. The why that assumed the proposal was real and asked for the reason of it. He was quiet for a moment. The drawing room was warm and small, and the fire was the only sound. "Because," he said, "I had spent 6 months becoming increasingly aware that the prospect of you marrying someone else was something I found," he paused, "selected, inadmissible." The word arrived with its full weight. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the tea went undrunk, and the winter light thinned in the windows. "I did not know," she said. "I want you to understand that. I did not know. The evening was... There were people who would have enjoyed..." She stopped. "I thought it was a performance. I thought someone had arranged it to humiliate me. I have been. The careful composure she had been maintaining since April shifted very slightly, like a wall that is held against weather for a long time and is registering the accumulated cost. I have been deeply sorry, she said, not for what I felt in the moment, which was bewilderment, but for the expression it took. I know, he said. I know that now. I did not know it in the moment, and I responded to it badly. I left. You left, she agreed. Not as accusation, as acknowledgement. I was, he said. And here was the thing she had not expected. Here was the quality she had not known she was waiting to encounter in him. I was frightened. Not of you, of what it would mean if it was real, and what it would mean if it was over. I have not done this. A pause, a very slight tension in his jaw, the internal effort of a man saying a thing he has spent 41 years not saying. I have not done this well in the past, allowed things to matter. I was better at leaving. She sat with this, with the specific courage it had taken to say it, with the image it gave her, not the cold and impenetrable Duke of London's imagination, but the actual person, sitting in a post house 41 miles from London with an untouched glass of brandy, being honest with himself at significant personal cost. And now? She asked. He looked at her. Now I am trying to be better at staying. The drawing room held them in its warmth for a long moment. Outside, a cart went by on the street, and a child called something to another child, and London continued in its indifferent daily way. And inside the room on Grosvenor Square adjacent, there was a fire, and a book on the table between them, and 6 months of accumulated weight beginning, very slowly, to shift. Tell me about the book, she said. He reached for his tea. Something in his shoulders, so subtle she might have imagined it, but she did not think she imagined it, released. Chapter 3, he said, is wrong. Chapter 3, she said, with the beginning of the expression she wore when she disagreed with someone and intended to say so, is the best chapter. He looked at her. It is not? It absolutely is. I will tell you exactly why it is not, he said, and settled back in the chair with the quality of a man who has found the thing he wanted to be doing with the afternoon. And she felt something move in her chest, warm and specific, and dangerous, and welcome, and thought, yes, this is how it begins. They argued about the book for 45 minutes, through 2 cups of tea and the declining November light, and Lady Ashworth returned to find them still talking, and made an expression that she took care to make only briefly in the hallway, before composing herself and entering the room. He stayed for another 20 minutes after that, in the proper company of all 3 of them, and when he left, he shook Lady Ashworth's hand with grave courtesy, and said goodbye to Alara with a look that said everything his formal leave-taking did not. And she stood in the hallway after the door closed, and pressed one hand briefly and privately against her sternum, where something was still warm. He came again on Monday, and on Thursday of the following week, and on the Monday after that. London, which had been watching with the combined attention of a city that had been waiting for this exact development for 6 months, observed each visit with the intensity of an audience at a very good play. Lady Meredith Fontaine reported on the duration of each call with the precision of a correspondent in the field. The fact that Miss Voss laughed, occasionally, and that the Duke of Ravenswood, on at least 2 occasions, was observed to smile, caused more private conversation than any event of the autumn season. Within a month, it was understood, not spoken aloud, because London was too sophisticated to speak things aloud before they were settled, but understood that something had changed, and was continuing to change, and that the laugh at the Hargreave ball, the laugh that had silenced the entire room and sent the Duke of Ravenswood out of London for half a year, was somehow the hinge on which the entire story had turned. What no one had yet understood, because they had not been present in Lady Ashworth's drawing room on the Tuesday afternoon, when Alara Voss said, with her hands wrapped around a teacup and the firelight on her face, I still think you're wrong about Chapter 3. And Julian Cavendish said, quietly, with the particular expression of a man who is in the process of losing an argument he has no interest in winning. I know you do. What no one had understood was that the laugh was not the problem. The laugh was the moment he had known. Not known she returned his feeling. That evidence came later, accumulated across 100 small moments, 100 carefully chosen words and unguarded looks, and late afternoon conversations that went on longer than either of them planned. But known that she was real, known that she was exactly who she had been presenting herself as all along, in every room where London had been waiting for her to be less. Known that the woman who would laugh, genuinely, unguardedly from the chest, at the worst possible moment, was not a woman who performed, who managed, who arranged herself for consumption. She was a woman who felt things entirely, and showed what she felt. He had been looking, without knowing he was looking, for someone who could not pretend, who laughed when something was absurd, even when a room full of witnesses was watching. He had been surrounded his entire life by people who performed their emotions for social effect, and he had become so skilled at the same performance that he had nearly performed himself into a life of total interior silence. And then Elara Voss had laughed at his proposal. And he had left. And he had come back. In the second week of December, on a morning when snow had fallen overnight and lay clean and sharp over the garden behind Lady Ashworth's townhouse, he arrived not at 4 o'clock, but at 11 in the morning, which was not a calling hour, and which Lady Ashworth acknowledged with a lifted eyebrow before sending for Elara and finding, once again, pressing business elsewhere in the house. He stood at the window with the snowlight coming in, and she stood in the doorway in a morning dress that was dark green and simple, and her hair was not yet fully arranged, and she was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was not expecting him, and was not hiding that she was not expecting him. "This is not a calling hour," she said. "No," he agreed. She came into the room. She did not sit. She stood near the fireplace with the snowlight at her back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and London was very quiet outside, under its fresh layer of white, and the fire was the only sound. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I want to say. A port. I've been thinking about it since April, since 41 miles south of London, in a post house. I have been—" Another pause, and she watched the effort in him, the cost of it, the discipline turned not toward concealment, but toward precision, toward saying the true thing, rather than the manageable one. "I have been practicing honesty," he said, "for 6 months, and I find that the most important thing still takes the most effort to say." She stood very still. Outside, a small wind moved through the snow in the garden, lifting a thin, cold breath of it against the window glass. "I know what happened in April," he said. "I know why you laughed. I know you did not know I meant it. I know I gave you no reason to know. That was my failure, entirely. And I have spent 6 months understanding it clearly." He held her gaze with his. "I am not here to ask you to account for it. I am here because—" He stopped. In the firelight, his face was open, in the way she had been catching in glimpses for 2 months. Open, and without the management that London associated with him, without the controlled distance that his reputation was built on. "Because I meant it then. I mean it now. With the full understanding of everything it will cost you socially, everything it will require you to navigate, all of the considerable complications of—" He stopped again. "With the full understanding of the cost," he said, "I am asking you again." The snow was very quiet outside. The fire made its small sound. The morning light was clean and cold and specific. She looked at him for a long time. She was aware, doing the thing she had spent 6 months learning how to do. She was feeling the full weight of something, without immediately finding a way to make it lighter. She was letting it be what it was. The cost was real. She could see it clearly, had been turning it over since the first visit, the complication of her position, the social architecture of his world, the places where she would not fit and would refuse to pretend otherwise, the opinions she would continue to have and express, the things about her that were not easily accommodated in the life he inhabited. She could see all of it. She could see him, too, standing in the snow light of December, in her guardian's drawing room, having come back 6 months after leaving, having spent those 6 months doing something she recognized and respected, paying attention to himself honestly, arriving at a truer accounting, being precise, saying the thing he meant. "I know what it will cost," she said. "I've been thinking about that too." She looked at him steadily. "I am not afraid of the cost." He was very still. "I am, however," she said, and the expression that moved across her face was the one he had first seen on the terrace in April, before everything, the one that was both entirely unguarded and entirely brave. "Going to continue to have opinions about Chapter 3. The silence lasted exactly long enough, and then, quietly, with the quality of something that had been building for 7 months and was no longer requiring to be contained, he smiled. Not the almost smile that London had occasionally reported, not the micro-expression of managed warmth, but a full and genuine smile, the kind that changed the whole architecture of a face, the kind that suggested he was capable of it, and had perhaps been capable of it for a long time, without sufficient cause to demonstrate. "I know," he said. She crossed the room. Not quickly. The movement had the quality of a choice being made with full awareness, each step the deliberate continuation of a decision already arrived at. She stopped when she was close enough that the snow light from the window fell across them both, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the distance between them was the smallest it had been, and what remained in that distance was not doubt. "Then yes," she said. "Yes." He lifted his hand and touched her face, his thumb brushing once against her cheek, the lightest possible contact, the touch of a man who has been very careful for a very long time, and is choosing now not to be. And she did not step back, and the fire continued its small sound. And outside, the London snow lay clean and cold over everything. And inside Lady Ashworth's drawing room, 2 people who had spent considerable portions of their lives being very accomplished at not being vulnerable, were, quietly, and at significant personal cost, and with full knowledge of what they were giving up in order to do it, choosing otherwise. Lady Ashworth came back into the room 45 minutes later than she had intended, citing the same urgent business she had cited on 3 previous occasions, and fully intending to cite it as often as necessary, and found them sitting in the chairs near the fire, with a book open between them. The book, the one from the drawing-room table, the one about Chapter 3, and found that Miss Voss was making a point about the 3rd chapter with the animation of someone who has had some time to sharpen her argument, and that the Duke of Ravenswood was listening with the specific quality of attention that Lady Ashworth, who had observed a great many people over a great many years, recognized as the rarest of social phenomena. A person being heard by someone who genuinely wanted to hear them. She sat down and accepted a cup of tea and said nothing in particular, and the conversation went on around the fire, and outside the December snow continued its slow industry of covering everything. And inside the room, 3 people, no, 2 people, with a very satisfied witness, existed in the particular warmth of a morning that would be, for reasons none of them articulated, remembered for a long time. They were married in February, not the elaborate production that London expected, not the social event of the season that Lady Meredith Fontaine had been provisionally planning in her imagination since December, but a small and specific ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a grey Tuesday morning when the city smelled of frost and coal smoke, with Edmund as witness, and Lady Ashworth dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and 30 guests who were there because they were genuinely loved, rather than because their presence was strategically advisable. She wore ivory, with green embroidery at the collar and cuffs, vines and small precise leaves that she had designed herself, and that her dressmaker had executed over the course of 3 weeks, with the focused devotion of a woman who understood she was making something important. He wore dark blue. He had, without telling her, chosen the color deliberately. She noticed. She did not say anything about it in the church, but she pressed her hand briefly against the lapel of his coat when they stood together at the altar, and he covered her hand with his for a moment, and the officiating minister, who was very experienced, waited patiently. When he said the words, the old words, the words that had been said in that church for over a century, his voice was very steady, and she looked at his face when he said them, and saw what was there, which was not performance, and not management, and not the controlled composure of public duty, but something that had the same quality as the snow light in Lady Ashworth's drawing room, clean and specific, and entirely real. She said the same words in the same voice she used when she meant things entirely. Edmund cried, which he would deny for the rest of his life, and which Julian would remind him of at every available opportunity. And Lady Ashworth did not deny it. And the 30 guests who were there because they were genuinely loved had the varied expressions of people witnessing something that was, despite, or perhaps because of its complications, right. Afterward, in the carriage to the wedding breakfast, she said, "London is going to have a great deal to say." "Yes," he agreed. "Lady Meredith Fontaine will be insufferable. She is always insufferable. She will now merely have additional material." "You don't mind," she said. Not a question, an observation, slightly surprised. He looked at her across the small space of the carriage. His wife. His. The words still had the quality of a door just opened, air moving through from somewhere else, the particular slightly stunned feeling of a real thing that has replaced a long-imagined one, and is better, and stranger, and more alive. "I find," he said, "that I mind considerably less than I expected to." She laughed. The real one, full-throated and unguarded, and rising out of her chest like a bird startled from cover. It lasted 4 seconds. It was the same laugh it had always been. He listened to it with the total attention of a man who had walked 41 miles south of London, carrying the absence of that exact sound, and who had no intention of walking away from it again, and felt, quietly, specifically, at significant personal cost, that he would pay again without hesitation, entirely, wholly, unmanageably glad. The years that followed were not simple. She had been right about the social cost. It arrived with the reliable efficiency of London's best organized networks, in the form of cold shoulders at gatherings, whispered assessments of her background and her opinions, and her laugh at the Hargreave ball, that people had not entirely stopped discussing even as it transformed, slowly, in the retelling, from an embarrassing breach into something more complicated and interesting. There were houses where she was received with the particular warmth reserved for people whom the hostess finds challenging and respects, and will not admit to either. There were houses where she was not received at all, which she noted and did not perform distress about. He stood with her, not in the performative way, not in the way of a man making a social statement. Julian Cavendish was not built for social statements, but in the practical, specific, daily way of a man who had decided a thing and was not available for renegotiation. When a hostess was cold, he was cooler. When an invitation was deliberately not extended, he declined the related invitations with the immovable courtesy of a man who had been managing social negotiations since he was 18 and had not lost the skill, only the motivation to use it on behalf of people who didn't merit it. London revised its understanding of what the Duke of Ravenswood would and would not accommodate, and this revision happened with more speed than London usually managed, because the Duke of Ravenswood had a history of being very clear about things. She watched him do this. She did not ask him to do it, and when she tried, once, to suggest that the cost was larger than she wanted to be responsible for, he looked at her with an expression that was the calmest and most final thing she had ever seen, and said, "The cost belongs to me. I am paying it exactly where I intend to." She had no answer to this that was adequate. She found this, in the long run, satisfying in a way she had not expected. Not the gesture itself, though the gesture mattered, but the principle behind it, the clarity of it, the absolute refusal to let her carry alone what was not hers to carry alone. She had been carrying things alone for a long time. She was learning, with the specific difficulty of a person who has learned self-sufficiency as a survival skill, to put things down. He was learning, in the same period, to pick things up. He had been a man of solitary habits and solitary decisions, accustomed to the clean efficiency of an interior life that didn't require management by committee. And he found the process of genuine partnership, the daily renegotiation, the obligation to say what he was thinking rather than implementing decisions and presenting conclusions, not always comfortable and consistently worthwhile. He said this to Edmund once, in the library, in the tone he used when he was making an admission that he found instructive. "It is," he said, "considerably more complicated than I anticipated." "Yes," Edmund said. "That's rather the point." They moved the following spring to Ravenswood itself, the family seat in Kent, a house of the kind that had been built to impress and had succeeded, and had spent the subsequent 200 years being impressive in an empty and slightly melancholy way. Elara walked through it on the first morning with the particular attention of a woman who was forming a verdict, and her verdict was delivered at breakfast. "The east wing," she said, "is not receiving adequate light. The windows want cleaning, and the furniture arrangement is working against the room's proportions. The library wants organization on principle rather than aesthetics. Someone has arranged the books by color, which is—" She stopped. "Who arranged the books by color?" "My father," Julian said, without looking up from his correspondence. A pause. "Your father was wrong about books," she said, and he looked up, and she was watching him with the careful expression she wore when she had said something that might have landed somewhere tender and was ready to recalibrate. "My father," he said, "was wrong about many things. And then, you may reorganize the library." She reorganized the library over 3 weeks in April, with the focused intensity of a woman doing something she found genuinely satisfying. And Julian came in occasionally, and watched and offered opinions, and was told, kindly but firmly, that the opinions were noted, and that she would consult him on the sections in which he had genuine expertise, which turned out to be philosophy, natural history, and Italian literature, and that the rest was in capable hands. He stood in the doorway of the library on the last evening of the 3rd week and looked at the results. The shelves rearranged by subject, and within subject by period, and within period alphabetically. The reading chairs repositioned to make use of the window light, the additional lamp she had argued for and obtained, and felt something that he had no precise word for, something to do with the presence of another person's intelligence and taste in a space that had been his alone for a long time, and the discovery that the space was not diminished by this, but enlarged. "Better?" she asked, from her position on a small stepladder near the far wall, reaching for a volume that needed repositioning. "Considerably," he said. She made a sound that was satisfaction, brief and privately pleased, and reached for another volume, and he stood in the doorway and watched her and thought, yes, this specific, particular, irreplaceable person, on a stepladder in his library, reorganizing his father's color-coded nonsense into something that made sense, in the warm lamplight of a Kent evening, entirely real, entirely present, entirely his, and him entirely hers, and the cost of everything that had preceded this moment, every cold room, every misread silence, every 41 miles of honest self-examination, entirely, absolutely, retroactively, worthwhile. The summer at Ravenswood brought the children. First, a daughter, fierce and bright-eyed, who arrived in July with the emphatic particularity of a person who knew exactly what she wanted and intended to get it, and who had her father's grey eyes and her mother's complete absence of social anxiety. Then, 2 years later, a son, who had his father's stillness and his mother's habit of laughing at precisely the wrong moment for entirely the right reasons, a quality that Julian found familiar and Elara found entirely just. Edmund came to stay every summer, and was the kind of uncle who could be talked into almost anything by the children, and who arrived on horseback with his coat pockets full of impractical gifts and his face wearing the expression of a man whose life was organized around the pleasures of other people's happiness. He brought books and told stories, and spent long evenings in the drawing room with Julian and Elara, talking about everything, the way people talk who have stopped performing for each other and arrived at the simpler, more demanding country of actual conversation. There was a particular evening in the 3rd summer, a Tuesday in late June, the children in bed, the long English dusk still warm at 9:30, Edmund in the garden with a glass of wine, and the comfortable absorption of a man who knows he is not required to perform, and Julian and Alara on the drawing-room sofa, with the windows open to the garden, and the sound of the evening birds, when she said, without preamble, looking at the ceiling, "Do you ever think about the terrace?" He knew which terrace. He knew which moment. "Sometimes," he said. "I have been thinking about it lately," she said. "I have been thinking that if I had known, if you had given me any indication at all, I would not have laughed. And then I think—" She paused. He waited. "I think perhaps it's better that I did." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the ceiling with the expression she wore when she was being honest about something she hadn't entirely intended to say. "Because," she said, "you came back. And you came back differently. You came back having done the thing you needed to do. And I came back having done the same. And we arrived at each other." She stopped. "More accurately," she said, "I think we arrived more accurately." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Edmund in the garden said something to himself and laughed at it, which was one of his more endearing qualities. "Yes," Julian said. "I think that's right." She turned her head to look at him. The evening light was the color of old gold through the windows, and her face in it was the face he had been memorizing for 4 years and would be memorizing for the rest of his life, always finding something new in it, always arriving at greater accuracy, always discovering that the thing he thought he fully knew was more than he had understood. "You are not wrong about Chapter 3, she said. "I want you to know that I know you are not wrong. I have known it since November." He looked at her. "And yet," she agreed, "you will continue to argue it." "I will continue to argue it," she confirmed. "It is one of the great pleasures of my life." He felt the smile come up in him the way it always did now, not the managed, minimal expression that London had observed in the years before April, not the controlled concession to warmth, but the whole thing, the full, irreversible architectural change to his face. He did not contain it. He had stopped containing it some time ago. She watched him smile and made the small, specific, privately satisfied sound she made when something was as good as she needed it to be. Outside, the evening at Ravenswood continued in its particular way. The birds and the garden and the warm late light over the Kent hills, the sound of the children settling in the upper rooms, Edmund in the garden talking to himself in a companionable way, the old house warm and lit with the evidence of being actually, genuinely, lived in, and inside, on the drawing-room sofa, 2 people who had found each other through the improbable door of a genuine laugh at the worst possible moment, who had spent 6 months becoming more honest with themselves, and then spent 4 years becoming more honest with each other, who had paid the costs clearly and fully, and looked back on the payment with satisfaction rather than regret. 2 people sat in the evening light and existed together in the particular, irreplaceable, entirely ordinary way of people who have chosen each other, and are choosing each other still, daily, with full knowledge of the price, and full conviction that it is the only price worth paying. They had not, either of them, believed this was possible. They believed it now. They believed it every morning and every evening and in every quiet space between, in every argument about Chapter 3 and every cold-shouldered ballroom and every late-night conversation in the library and every child's laugh from the upper rooms and every summer evening in Kent with the windows open and the gold light coming in. They believed it in the way of people who had learned belief the hard way and were not, therefore, taking it lightly. They believed it in the way of people who had been and were and chose always to remain, entirely, gratefully, permanently found.